Baruch Spinoza was sitting in a rented room in Amsterdam in the 1660s, reading a church father in Latin, when he found something that no one who had read that same text before him seemed to want to discuss. He wasn't looking for contradictions. He wasn't conducting an investigation. He was reading the way he always read, carefully, without deciding in advance what the text was supposed to say. And in 3 separate documents, written by 3 separate men who never met each other, who lived across 3 different centuries, he found the same admission recorded in plain language. They told you the Gospels were transmitted perfectly across 2,000 years, faithfully copied, carefully preserved, unchanged in all the things that matter. They told you the text you hold today is substantially what the first disciples wrote down, what the early churches passed on, what the tradition protected with reverence and precision. 3 bishops wrote otherwise, in their own hand, in letters that still exist. That is what Spinoza found. Not a rumor, not a rival sect's accusation, not a theory assembled from silence and inference. He found the men who built the Bible as we know it, the men who copied it, corrected it, and authorized its final shape, writing in their own documents that the manuscripts they worked with differed from each other, that texts had been altered with deliberate intent, and that the process of choosing which words would survive and which would be set aside was, from the beginning, a human process conducted by human hands for human reasons. I want to walk through those 3 documents, the names on them, the dates, the words they actually contain. Because what Spinoza understood, what made him different from the scholars who read the same pages and saw nothing disturbing, was that he read them as a historian reads evidence, not as a devotional exercise, not as a confirmation of something he already believed, as evidence. And the evidence is remarkable. The first letter is from a man named Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus. You know him as Jerome. It is the year 382 in the Common Era. Pope Damasus I is the Bishop of Rome, and he has a problem. The Latin translations of the New Testament that circulate through the Western Church, the translations that ordinary priests use, that congregations hear read aloud from the pulpit, that bishops rely on for rulings and arguments and doctrine, are not consistent with each other. They vary, sometimes significantly. Damasus knows this because his correspondents tell him, because manuscripts arrive from different provinces with different words in places where words should be identical, and because anyone who compares 2 copies with any care at all can see that something has gone wrong in the transmission. So he commissions his finest scholar. Jerome is the greatest biblical scholar of the 4th century. He reads Hebrew fluently, which almost no other Latin Christian can claim. He knows Greek, he knows Latin. He has the breadth and the rigorous habits of mind to do what Damasus is asking. Examine the manuscripts, compare them to the Greek originals, and produce a reliable, authoritative Latin text. Jerome travels to Bethlehem. He sets himself up in a small stone cell and surrounds himself with piles of manuscripts, rolls and codices in Greek, old Latin versions in multiple regional variants, reference copies that have been passed between churches for generations. He reads versions against each other. He makes decisions, he writes, and before he submits his work, he writes a formal prefatory letter to the Pope explaining what he has done and why. In that letter, Jerome writes something that no one in the hierarchy seems to have wanted future generations to read as carefully as they should have. He writes, "You urge me to revise the old Latin version, and as it were to sit in judgment on the copies of the scriptures which are now scattered throughout the whole world. And, inasmuch as they differ from one another, you would have me decide which of them agree with the Greek original. Read that carefully. The copies of the scriptures are scattered throughout the whole world. They differ from one another. The Pope has asked Jerome to decide which ones agree with the Greek original, not to transcribe a pure text that has been faithfully preserved, to decide between versions that already disagree." And Jerome, being a careful scholar, is honest about what that decision process involves. He writes further, "But to avoid any great divergences from the Latin which we are accustomed to read, I have used my pen with some restraint, and while I have corrected only such passages as seem to convey a different meaning, I have allowed the rest to remain as they are." He corrected passages that seemed to convey a different meaning. He allowed the rest to remain. He used his pen with restraint, meaning he chose not to correct everything, because doing so would create too much disruption for congregations accustomed to the existing text. Jerome is telling the Pope that he made editorial choices, that he preserved some things not because they were certainly correct, but because changing them would cause problems. And then, the phrase that I keep coming back to, the phrase that Spinoza would have read and set down on his desk and thought about for a long time. Jerome writes about the state of the manuscripts he has examined. Tot enim sunt exemplaria paene quot codices. There are as many versions as there are manuscripts. He wrote that in 382 AD. The man commissioned to produce the authoritative Bible for Western Christianity, writing to the Pope who commissioned him, said, "There are as many versions as there are manuscripts." That version of the Bible, Jerome's Vulgate, the product of the choices described in that letter, became the official Bible of the Catholic Church. For 1,000 years, from the 5th century to the 15th, the Vulgate was the Scriptures. The choices Jerome made about which passages to fix and which to leave unchanged became for an entire millennium the Word of God. And the letter he wrote to the Pope explaining the process has sat in the patristic record ever since. Spinoza read it. The second document is older, much older. Around the year 170 in the Common Era, the Bishop of Corinth, a man named Dionysius, writes a series of letters to other churches. Corinth is an important community founded by Paul in person. The church there traces itself directly to the apostle, and its bishop carries the corresponding weight. Dionysius writes to Rome, to Athens, to churches in Pontus and Crete. His letters circulate widely, and then he discovers something that disturbs him enough that he addresses it directly in his correspondence. His letters have been altered. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century, quotes directly from one of Dionysius's letters. And in that letter, Dionysius writes about what has happened to his own writings in circulation. He says, "And these letters the apostles of the devil have filled with tares, taking away some things and adding others, for whom a woe is in store. Tares, weeds sown among wheat, things taken away, things added." Dionysius is describing his own letters being altered in transmission, words removed, words inserted, by people he calls the apostles of the devil. That alone would be significant. A bishop in 170 AD writing that letters are falsified in circulation, but then he draws the natural conclusion. In the same passage preserved by Eusebius, Dionysius writes, "It is not wonderful then if some have attempted to adulterate the Lord's writings when they have formed designs against those which are not such." Read that carefully. He calls the Gospels the Lord's writings. And he says it is not wonderful, not surprising, not astonishing, not unexpected, if people have attempted to adulterate them. The Bishop of Corinth, the man who inherited the community that Paul founded, writing in 170 AD, less than 100 years after the events described in the Gospels, using the word adulterate for the sacred texts. He uses it as the logical extension of what he knows is happening to his own letters. "If my correspondence gets altered," he says, "of course the Lord's writings would face the same treatment, the same hands, the same temptation, the same result." Dionysius is not speculating. He is not theorizing about something that might happen. He is describing a landscape he knows. He lives inside it. He is Bishop of Corinth, and people are rewriting his letters while he is still alive, and the letters are still warm. His conclusion about the Gospels is not a wild leap. It is the observation of a man who understands exactly how texts travel between communities, how that travel creates opportunities for those who want to shape what a text says, and what the inevitable result is for documents sacred enough that everyone wants them to say the right thing. That letter survives because Eusebius quoted it in his ecclesiastical history, a church historian making a record of the early bishops, preserving the quote as part of the historical record. Spinoza read Eusebius, and he found the quote. The third document is from a man who believed more fervently in the Christian scriptures than almost anyone in the history of the church. Origen of Alexandria is the greatest biblical scholar of the 3rd century, and possibly of the entire ancient church. He writes commentaries on nearly every book of the Old and New Testaments. He produces a massive comparative edition of the scriptures called the Hexapla, setting 6 versions side by side in parallel columns so that discrepancies can be seen and analyzed. He is not a skeptic. He is a defender of the faith who believes deeply in the divine inspiration of the texts. And because he believes deeply, he looks at those texts with precision. And because he looks with precision, he sees what is actually there. Around 244 AD, in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, Origen writes about the state of the manuscripts he works with. He writes, "The differences among the manuscripts have become great, either through the negligence of some copyists or through the perverse audacity of others. They either neglect to check over what they have transcribed, or in the process of checking, they lengthen or shorten as they please." 2 categories, 2 distinct causes. The first is negligence. Copyists who did not check their work carefully. Scribal errors that crept in and were never caught. Honest mistakes made by tired hands and wandering attention. This is the explanation that the tradition is most comfortable with, because it implies the changes were unintentional, and the original text can, in principle, be recovered by careful scholarship. But Origen does not stop there. He adds a second category, perverse audacity. People who, in the process of copying, deliberately lengthen or shorten the text as they please. Not mistakes, decisions, choices made by people who thought they knew better than the manuscript in front of them, or who wanted the text to say something slightly different from what it said, or who were working from a theological conviction about what the correct reading should be. Origen does not soften that. He calls it perverse audacity. He is not describing a minor scribal convention. He is describing something he finds disturbing. People rewriting sacred text according to their own judgment, with their own hands, in the copying rooms of Christian communities across the Mediterranean world. 3 men, 3 documents, 3 separate centuries. Dionysius writes around 170 AD. Origen writes around 244 AD. Jerome writes in 382 AD. They do not know each other. They cannot coordinate. Each man is writing from his own context, his own community, his own experience of working with the manuscripts of the early church. And each man records the same fundamental observation. The texts differ from each other. The differences include deliberate changes, and the process of alteration is not a theoretical possibility, but an observed reality. That is a pattern, and Spinoza saw it as a pattern. I want to tell you what the standard response to all of this is, because it deserves to be heard. The argument runs like this. We have more manuscripts of the New Testament than of any other ancient document, thousands of them, in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian. When scholars compare them through textual criticism, the vast majority of the text is stable. The variations exist, but most are trivial. Spelling differences, word order, the occasional insertion of a familiar phrase from another gospel. The original text can be recovered through careful scholarly analysis. This is a serious argument made by serious scholars. Textual criticism is a real discipline, but there is a number that sits inside this argument like a splinter. Scholars estimate between 200,000 and 400,000 textual variants in the surviving Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. That figure comes not from critics, but from Bruce Metzger, one of the greatest textual critics of the 20th century, and from Bart Ehrman, who studied under Metzger. 200,000 to 400,000. Most are minor, but the cases at the larger end of the scale are not minor, and they are not hidden. Most modern Bibles print them in footnotes, which means you can look at them yourself. Open almost any modern Bible to the end of the Gospel of Mark. Read to chapter 16, verse 8. The women have found the empty tomb. An angel has told them Jesus has risen and gone ahead to Galilee. And then the text says, the women fled and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The chapter ends. That is how the oldest manuscripts end Mark, with the women afraid and silent. No risen Jesus appearing to the disciples. No commission to go into all the world. No handling of serpents. No ascension. The 12 verses that follow verse 8 in most Bibles, Mark 16:9 through 20, are absent from Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, the 2 oldest and most complete Greek manuscripts we have. They appear to have been added by someone who thought an ending with frightened women and silence was insufficient. The footnotes in your Bible almost certainly tell you this. Now turn to John chapter 7 verse 53 through chapter 8 verse 11. The story of the woman caught in adultery. The Pharisees bring her to Jesus, demanding she be stoned. Jesus writes in the dirt. He says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." The crowd disperses. Jesus turns to the woman and says he does not condemn her. That story is absent from Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. It does not appear in the oldest Syriac translations or the oldest Latin versions. It appears to have wandered between positions in the manuscripts, sometimes at the end of John, sometimes after Luke 21:38. The handwriting in some manuscripts marks it as an insertion. The most famous story about the compassion of Jesus toward a sinner may not have been in the original Gospel of John. Your Bible's footnote probably says, "The earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811, and Luke 22:43 and 44, the scene in Gethsemane where Jesus sweats drops of blood and an angel comes to strengthen him. Those two verses are missing from many important early manuscripts. The church fathers who quote from Luke in the early centuries sometimes include them and sometimes do not, depending on which text they were working from. Origen described this, the passages that are lengthened or shortened as they please. He was watching it happen. Jerome described this, the copies scattered throughout the whole world that differ from one another in places where they should be the same. He was hired to fix it. Dionysius described this, the apostles of the devil filling texts with terrors, taking away some things and adding others. He knew what it looked like because he had seen it done to his own letters. The bishops were not issuing warnings about a distant theoretical risk. They were describing an ongoing reality they lived inside, and that reality left its marks in the manuscripts that modern scholars now count and catalogue and analyze. The marks are still there. What Spinoza understood, and what I think makes his reading of these texts so particular, is that he approached the patristic library the way a historian approaches primary sources. The theologians who read Jerome and Dionysius and Origen before Spinoza were reading for doctrine, for the arguments those men had made in defense of the faith. When they encountered a passage where a church father admitted difficulty with the manuscripts, they noted it as a technical observation and moved on. The faith was not in the manuscripts, they would say. The faith was in the message. The Spirit had preserved what mattered. Spinoza did not bring that frame to the page. He sat in that rented room in Amsterdam with no professional obligation to the church, reading Latin, reading philosophy and mathematics and natural science, reading the church fathers the way he read Euclid, looking for what the text actually claimed, not for what tradition had decided it meant. And he found three men, writing across 3 centuries, recording in plain sentences the thing that the institution had taught people for 1,000 years had not happened. I think about a man I used to have lunch with every Friday. His name was Earl Hutchins. We had been at the same school, history teachers, both of us, for almost 30 years, from my first year teaching there in the late 60s until we retired within a few years of each other in the 90s. We ate at a diner on Magnolia Avenue, a place called Wonders that had brown vinyl booths and always smelled like coffee and bacon fat. In the early years, we would bring papers to grade and leave them on the table, mostly untouched, while we talked. Later, we didn't bring anything, we just talked. Earl was a believing man, Methodist, not Baptist like me, but serious about it in the same way, the kind of man who reads scripture carefully, with the assumption that it matters what it actually says. He had a scholar's instinct even though he taught high school. He would have made a fine historian of the church if he had gone in that direction. When these videos began to circulate, Earl called me. We met for lunch, not on a Friday, at Wonders. He ordered the usual, eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee with 1 sugar, and he listened to what I was working on. When I finished, he sat for a moment, and then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "I just don't think that's the right way to use what we know, Howard." I tried to explain Jerome's letter, the prefatory letter to Pope Damasus, Jerome writing that the copies were scattered throughout the whole world and differed from one another. Tot enim sunt exemplaria paene quot codices. There are as many versions as there are manuscripts. I told him this was Jerome, the man who made the Vulgate, the man who produced the Bible that 1 billion people's ancestors had as their only Bible for 1,000 years. Earl listened the way he always listened, which was completely. He did not interrupt, he did not argue. When I finished, he nodded once, slowly, and he said he understood what I was saying. We talked for another 20 minutes about other things, then we paid and left. That was a Thursday in early October. The Friday lunches stopped. There was no conversation about it, no phone call, no explanation. I called him once in November, and we spoke briefly about something else, and that was fine. But he didn't suggest we get together, and I didn't push. About 3 weeks after that Thursday lunch, I drove past Wanda's on the way to the hardware store, and I pulled into the parking lot and sat there with the engine running for about 10 minutes. I don't know exactly what I was thinking about. I know I thought about Earl sitting in that brown booth with his eggs over easy. I thought about what he would have said if I had asked him directly. If Jerome wrote to the Pope admitting he was choosing between versions, and if that letter has been sitting in the patristic record for 1600 years, what does that mean for the claim that the text was perfectly preserved? I think he would have said something careful, something that honored both the evidence and the faith. Earl had a way of holding two difficult truths in the same sentence without making either one disappear. But we didn't have that conversation. The Fridays at Wanda's ended without either of us saying that they had. I drove to the hardware store. I bought what I needed. I drove home. I want to be precise about what the bishops were doing. Jerome was not confessing to a fraud. He believed he was restoring the text to something more correct. He had access to Greek manuscripts that older Latin versions did not reflect accurately. When he corrected a passage that seemed to convey a different meaning, he thought he was bringing the Latin into line with the original. His intention was fidelity. Dionysius was not describing an organized conspiracy. He was describing a decentralized reality that anyone who worked with texts in the ancient world would recognize. Letters traveled by hand, copied by people with varying skill and varying agendas, in a world without printing, without archives, without any central authority that could certify a copy's accuracy. The multiplication of versions was not a surprise. It was the nature of manuscript culture. Origen was not a critic, he was a defender. He described the problem because he was trying to solve it. The Hexapla, his great parallel text edition, was an attempt to bring order to the disorder he documented. He cared intensely that the text be right. These men were not saboteurs. They were scholars and shepherds trying to manage a process that was already in motion when they found it. In motion since the first letters of Paul were copied and shared, since the first Gospels circulated between communities that had never met the people who wrote them. The problem is not what they did. The problem is the centuries of institutional teaching that came after them, teaching that described the text as essentially unchanged, as divinely preserved, as transmitted with a fidelity that bordered on the miraculous. That teaching is what Spinoza held up against the patristic record, and the patristic record contradicted it, not in whispers or implications, but in the plain Latin sentences of the men who had actually done the transmitting. If the text was formed by human choices, and Jerome's letter makes clear that it was, then the honest questions are, which choices, made by whom, for what reasons? When the scribes Origen describes were lengthening and shortening the text as they pleased, what were they adding and removing, and why? When Jerome corrected passages that seemed to convey a different meaning, what meaning did the uncorrected version convey? And why did he judge the Greek version more authoritative than what the Latin communities had always heard? These are questions that a faith grounded in human history can ask. They are only forbidden to a faith that depends on the claim that the text was never touched. Spinoza was not the last man to sit in a quiet room and find things in the patristic record that others had read past. He was one of the first to understand what those things meant when read together, as a pattern. When he set aside Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, the volume that contained Dionysius's letter about the apostles of the devil, he would have known he was not working with new information. That letter had been in Eusebius for more than 13 centuries. Every scholar who had worked through that history had encountered the same passage. They had read it as a historical curiosity, an administrative complaint from an early bishop, interesting for what it tells us about manuscript culture in the 2nd century. Spinoza read it as evidence. He did the same with Jerome's prefatory letter, the same with Origen's commentary on Matthew. These were not obscure texts in a secret archive. They were standard documents in the patristic library. The problem was not their availability. The problem was the way they were read, with the conclusion already decided. With the question, did the transmission of the text involve deliberate human changes, already answered before the page was opened. Spinoza opened the page without the answer written in advance. And 3 bishops told him what had happened. He did not need a hidden archive. He did not need a suppressed manuscript or an archaeological discovery. He needed only to read what was already there. The bishops didn't hide the changes. They wrote them down. The question was never whether the evidence existed. It had been sitting in the patristic library for over 1,000 years, in plain Latin, in the handwriting of the men who did the work. The question was always who was reading it and what they were willing to see. If this opened something for you, write truth in the comments. The thread runs deep, and we are going to follow it.